The year was 1812. The month was June. At the edge of the Niemen River, on the border of the Russian Empire, stood a force the likes of which the world had never seen. Over 600,000 men. Soldiers from France, Italy, Poland, Germany, and beyond. This was the Grand Armée, and at its head was the most powerful man on earth, Napoleon Bonaparte. He wasn't just looking for a battle. He was looking to crush a defiance. Tsar Alexander I had walked away from the continental system, reopening trade with the British. To Napoleon, this was more than a trade dispute. It was a betrayal. He believed the war would be over in 20 days. He thought he would strike a decisive blow, force a peace treaty, and return to Paris in glory. But as the first French boots touched Russian soil on June 24th, a strange, eerie silence greeted them. There was no Russian army waiting to fight. There were no grand formations. There was only the vast, empty horizon. This was the beginning of the end. This was the start of the frozen disaster. Napoleon's strategy was simple. Find the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them. But the Russian commanders, Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, did something Napoleon didn't expect. They retreated. They fell back deeper and deeper into the heart of Russia, drawing the French further away from their supply lines. And as they retreated, they practiced a brutal, effective policy. Scorched earth. Every farm was burned. Every well was poisoned. Every grain silo was emptied. The Grand Armée, which traditionally lived off the land to move fast, found itself starving in a wasteland of its own making. By the time the army reached the city of Smolensk in August, the summer heat was becoming as deadly as any bullet. Thousands of men were collapsing from heat stroke and typhus. Horses were dying by the tens of thousands because there was no fodder. The invincible army was already rotting from within, and they hadn't even fought a major battle yet. The Russian people were furious. They couldn't understand why their generals kept running. Finally, the Tsar appointed a new commander, Mikhail Kutuzov. He was old, he was one-eyed, and he knew that he couldn't run forever. On September 7th, 1812, just 70 miles from Moscow, the two giants finally collided at the Battle of Borodino. It was the single bloodiest day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. For 15 hours, the ground literally shook from the roar of over 1,000 cannons. Men were mowed down in rows. There was no room for brilliant tactics. It was a brutal, frontal slugfest in the mud. By sunset, over 70,000 men lay dead or wounded. Napoleon won the field, but he didn't destroy the Russian army. Kutuzov retreated in good order, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon thought he had won the war. In reality, he had just walked into the jaws of a trap. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow. He expected a delegation of city officials to hand him the keys to the Kremlin. Instead, he found a ghost town. Over 90% of the population had fled. That night, the sky turned red. The Russians had left behind secret agents to set the city on fire. Moscow, a city made largely of wood, became a towering inferno. For 4 days the fire raged, destroying the shelter and the supplies the French so desperately needed. Napoleon waited in the ruins for 5 weeks. He sent letters to the Tsar offering peace. Alexander didn't even respond. The Tsar knew what Napoleon didn't. The Russian winter was coming. On October 19th, with the first snowflakes beginning to fall, Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat. It was far, far too late. The retreat from Moscow is one of the greatest horrors in military history. The Grand Armée was no longer an army. It was a ghost march of starving men, followed by miles of wagons filled with looted gold and silk that they would eventually have to abandon. Then the temperature plummeted. It wasn't just cold, it was general winter. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Men's breath froze on their faces. Those who sat down to rest for 5 minutes never got up again. Those who fell behind were picked off by the Cossacks, the elite Russian light cavalry who haunted the French flanks like wolves. Cannons were abandoned because the horses were all dead. Men ate raw horse meat to survive. Thousands drowned while crossing the icy Berezina River, where the brave French engineers worked in freezing water to build bridges, knowing they would die of hypothermia to save their comrades. By December, the disaster was complete. Napoleon abandoned his troops to rush back to Paris and raise a new army, but the Grand Armée was gone. Of the 600,000 men who crossed the Niemen in June, fewer than 40,000 staggered back across in December. The Russian campaign didn't just cost Napoleon a war, it cost him his legend of invincibility. It was the moment the world realized the giant could be killed. Within 2 years, the coalition would be in Paris, and the emperor would be in exile. The snows of Russia didn't just bury soldiers, they buried an empire. Today, the bones of the Grand Armée are still being found in the Russian soil. A silent, grim reminder of what happens when ambition meets the unstoppable force of nature and a people who refuse to be conquered.